Okay, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for this very exciting shiur. Professor Marc Brettler is a member of the American Academy for Jewish Research and the Council of the Society of Biblical Literature, and is the Bernice Morton Lerner Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. He is the Dora Golding Professor of Biblical Studies Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies at Brandeis, where he graduated from. And he's the co-editor of the Jewish Study Bible, How to Read the Bible, co-editor with Amy Jill Levine of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, and co-author of the Bible and the Believer, How to Read the Bible Critically and Religiously, and also many other books. And he's written for The Forward, The Jerusalem Report. He's appeared in the television series The Mysteries of the Bible. He's been heard on NPR and All Things Considered, on Fresh Air with Terry Gross. And we are so thrilled to have him here. And I also want to introduce Professor Daniel Herskowitz, the Smart Family Professor in Judaic Studies and Associate Professor of Religious Studies in the Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. He's an intellectual historian and a scholar of religion. He teaches and researches philosophy, Jewish thought, Jewish-Christian relations, nationalism, and secularism. Before moving to Duke, he was the research fellow and lecturer at the University of Oxford and Columbia University. He asked me not to tell you about his books, but I'm going to tell you anyway. He's written a book about Heidegger and the Jewish reception, and also the Judeo-Christian thought of Franz Rosenzweig. And he's the editor of Hans Jonas, The Early Years. He's currently writing a book on the Second Vatican Council and the Jews, which is our topic today. And he's a recipient of the 2025-26 Thomas Langford Lectureship Award from Duke University. Without further ado, welcome to you both, and thank you for giving us your time.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi Posner, and thank you, Rabbi Graber, for inviting us, the mic. Oh, I'm sorry. Here we are. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation to talk about the document Nostra Aetate, and thank you for staying here after lunch. I need to hold the mic. That's what I'll do. Here we are. Here. Is that better? Wonderful. Okay. So let me begin by saying that all of us here live in a period that we almost take for granted the fact that members of different religions, Jews, Christians, Muslims, etc., can engage with each other on a plane of mutual respect and understanding. But sometimes we forget just what a dramatic shift this is in the history of religions, that this is possible, that interfaith dialogue is something that we could forget of just what a revolution it is. And one of the reasons why we tend to take this for granted is because 60 years ago, a document was composed, a document that we know today as Nostra Aetate, which is rightly seen as a watershed moment in this shift towards interfaith dialogue. And that's what I will give a brief overview, a historical overview of how this document came to be and some of its ideas and debates that were, circulated around it constantly. And then Marc will talk a little bit about what happened since then, and a few private, personal reflections. So, Nostra Aetate the document is called Nostra Aetate after the first two words of the document, which is in Latin, and the meaning is in our time, okay? And the official title of the document is the Church's relation to non-Catholic religions. And it's dedicated to the Catholic Church's reflections, rethinking of its attitude towards non-Catholic religions. And these include Muslims, Buddhism, Hinduism, and also Judaism, which constitutes its longest and also most important part. And this document was composed and then certified in the context of a Catholic council that took place in the 1960s, between 1962 and 1965, the Second Vatican Council. And I'll say a little bit more about the council in a moment. But what is important to note from the very beginning is that Nostra Aetate did not start out as being the document on the Catholic Church's relation to non-Catholic religions, but rather its original name was, again in Latin, Decretum Dei Deis, which is the decree on the Jews. And it started out a document only on the Jews. And now let's try to understand what happened. Towards the end of the 1950s, okay, so we're talking about the world after World War II, the world after the Holocaust, the Catholic Pope at the time, who was Pope John the 23rd, believed that the world has changed. And what has to happen is he wants to organize a council that would bring together all the leaders of the Catholic Church to rethink the Church's attitude towards the world, to instigate an internal renewal, and to build bridges to the world. Now, a council is a very significant, dramatic event in the Catholic world. It happens about once a century. So this one was the number 21, 20 centuries, just about. But usually, historically, these councils were dedicated to renounce heresies. And this time, the aim was to be a positive council and to build bridges with the world. And it had a jam-packed agenda. And one of the topics on the agenda was the Church's attitude towards Jews and Judaism. Now, originally the plan was, in the first session of the council, to write up a document which would stress the close bonds between Judaism and Christianity, condemn anti-Semitism, and call for mutual understanding and respect between Jews and Christians. And the thought was that this was going to be rather straightforward, and they would vote on it in the first session and then move on to deal with a lot of other very important issues. But that's not what happened. It didn't come up to vote in the first session, nor in the second session of the council, nor in the third, and only at the very, very end of the fourth and final session was the document on the Jews, now completely different, did it come up to vote and was certified by the Council Fathers and by the Pope. And what was hoped to be a rather straightforward document ended up being deeply, deeply disputed and the center of political and theological debates and public outcries. And at some point, one of a high-ranking cardinal said that to the world, the entire world is looking to the council, and what it would think about the entire council will be determined by the fate of the document on the Jews. And I want us to understand why. Why was this such a complicated, explosive document? And the reason for this is because it forced the Catholic Church to address its thorny legacy with regards to Judaism and the Jews. Now, on the one hand, Judaism is the cradle of Christianity, right? It's the origin of Christianity, and all the central holy figures of Christianity, Jesus, Mary, his students, were all Jews. On the other hand, traditionally within Christian teachings, there is also a consistent negative image of Jews. And this is rooted in this notion that originally the Jews were the chosen people, but after they refused to accept Jesus, they are no longer the chosen people. And in fact, they are a rejected people. And the fact that the Jews were in exile and persecuted was precisely the historical proof that they are punished by God. Okay, this was a long-standing traditional understanding, a Christian understanding of the Jews. And not only did the Jews reject Jesus, but in fact they were especially and collectively guilty of what, this is the official term, theological term, deicide. Now, dei means God, side means killing of. So the Jews were especially and collectively guilty of the killing of Jesus, okay? Now, this is based on a specific very selective interpretation of certain verses in the New Testament, and we have here a world-renowned scholar of precisely these topics. But this was how it was read, and I should also note the accusation that Jews are collectively guilty of killing Jesus never was official Christian dogma. But even without being official, it was pretty much accepted as a common view. Now, the question is, if the Catholic Church, after the Holocaust, wants to rethink its attitude towards the Jews in Judaism, will it rethink this accusation of Jewish deicide? And there was another very thorny point that was, at the heart of Catholic attitude towards Jews, which is the hope that ultimately the Jews will understand that they were wrong, understand that they have been historically very, very stubborn, and join the church and convert. So the question is this document on the Jews going to rethink these two very central points with regards to the Jews? Deicide, killing of Jesus, and the hope for conversion. It's a very thorny question. Now, the issue is that within the Catholic Church, it was deeply, deeply divided. Some within the church, it was a very forceful voice within the church, that said, we know exactly what the church's attitude towards the Jews is. It was, and still is, the same, right? We hope the Jews will convert, and the only way for them to be forgiven for their grave sin of responsibility for killing Jesus is by converting. That's not going to change. Anti-Semitism is horrible, of course it is, but that doesn't mean that we're not hoping the Jews are going to convert. That was one voice within the church. Another voice within the church said, we actually have an opportunity to really rethink our attitude towards Jews and Judaism and to start a new era of dialogue and understanding. And what happened with this document is that it underwent 6-7 different drafts. Each time these two thorny points, accusation of deicide, hope for conversion, were either inserted into the document or taken out of the document according to the tug of war between these two camps within the church, between the progressive and conservative voices within the church. And this is how it went on for about 4 years. An additional complication with this document was not theological but political. Throughout the entire council, there was constant pressure coming from Arab states in the Middle East, led by Nasser, Egypt's president, that objected to the very writing of a document on the Jews. And their explanation was this. They said, what the document of on the Jews actually is a sophisticated ploy. It's a sophisticated tactic by the Catholic Church that is trying, actually what's happening is that this theological decree is a smokescreen to the actual aim of the document, which is setting the stage for diplomatically, politically recognizing the state of Israel, which the Vatican did not at the time. Okay, so the Arabs thought that this is not about theology at all. The Christian world is warming up towards the Jews, and actually the end goal is to establish ties with Israel. So there was a lot of pressure coming from the Arabs. There's actually also threats saying if this document follows through, well, we can't protect Catholics within our states, okay? So this was a very, very thorny topic. And this is one of the reasons why ultimately the document on the Jews ended up being expanded into the church's relation to non-Catholic religions. So in order to soften the blow, the Catholic Church decided to address not only Judaism, but Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and also what they call people of goodwill, which is secular people who are moral. Now, I wanted to say a few words on the Jewish activity within the council, and then I'll conclude. As part of the council's desire to have a positive council and to build bridges, it sought the advice and insight from the Jewish world, and it approached Jewish leaders to hear what they were hoping would come out from the council. And this led to an internal debate within the Jewish world as to whether or not Jews should be involved in this council at all. Some said this is an internal Catholic event and Jews have no place in it. Others thought that not only was this appropriate, but this was actually a golden opportunity to really address centuries of anti-Jewish teachings within the Catholic Church. And what ended up happening is those who were cooperative with the church worked tirelessly for 4 years, mostly behind the scenes, to try to advocate for what they considered a strong and positive declaration on the Jews. And there is a huge correspondence between high-ranking officials within the Vatican and Jewish figures. They submitted memoranda and studies about Catholic-Jewish relations, and also organized a number of audiences, official meetings with very powerful cardinals, and also a number of times with the Pope. And as a general rule, even those within the Jewish world who thought that cooperation with the council was a positive thing, their real aim was to combat anti-Semitism and prejudice against Jews. And they believed that there's really no way to uproot anti-Semitism in the world without addressing its foundation in anti-Jewish teachings within Christianity. So their aim, they didn't think that they were in the position to demand Christianity to change its teachings. But they said that if from now on, no preacher on his in his sermon on Sunday, it talks about the Jews with any of these traditional negative images about Jews, well, that will have direct and immediate effect on what the congregation thinks about Jews, and that will decrease anti-Semitism. So this is why they believed it was important to engage with the council. In any event, the council continued to go through this messy and convoluted journey until at the end of the fourth session, it was voted on with an overwhelming majority, 2,800 for, 165 against. And it was voted on this document that we now know as Nostra Aetate, a central part on Judaism, but not only. And at the end, Nostra Aetate does not express the hope that Jews convert to the Catholic Church, though it hints to it. And it basically says that Jews cannot be accused of collective responsibility to the killing of Christ, neither all Jews in the time of Jesus, nor all Jews afterwards, but it does not use explicitly the term deicide, which was very, very charged. This was a historical moment in interfaith dialogue in Jewish-Christian relations, and it was seen as such at the time, though many saw the final document as a watered-down version of previous versions, and some saw it as a compromise. And it's not a perfect document. Few documents are. But the importance of Nostra Aetate lies not so much in the fact that it is the end of the Catholic Church's rethinking of its relationship with Judaism, but rather in the fact that it opened new doors, and it actually was the beginning of a process that continues on till today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. That was great, important background information for the document itself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the document and about what has happened subsequently, picking up with your notion that it is an imperfect document. And it is a Jewish tradition to begin with the negative and then deal with the positive. That's the structure of the Haggadah. I'm talking about a Catholic document, so I'm going to begin with the positive and then go to the negative. Okay. It's incredibly positive in the way in which it views all people outside of the Catholic Church. So that here you have an official Catholic document for the first time saying, and I apologize a bit, I'm not giving background, I need to give you some of the nitty gritty of this and the other documents. So I'm going to quote quite a bit. It says, the church reproves as foreign to the mind of Christ any discrimination against men or harassment of them because of their race, color, condition of life, or religion. A remarkable statement in 1965. And again, it's really important to try to remember the background of the 60s, whether we're talking in America or we are talking in Europe. It also says, has a very positive attitude toward what I'm here going to intentionally call the Old Testament. The church, therefore, cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament through the people with whom God, in his inexpressible mercy, concluded the ancient covenant. Now, that too is a very important claim. So even though he was declared a heretic, a Marcion, who claimed that the God of the Old Testament was different than the God of the New Testament, and tried to create a canon in which the Old Testament did not exist at all, his ideas, which included a very strong contrast between law and love, remained very standard within the church for 2 millennia, and almost 2 millennia, and this clear declaration is very important. Furthermore, its claim, since the spiritual patrimony common to Christians and Jews is thus so great, this sacred synod wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect, which is the fruit, above all, of biblical and theological studies, as well as fraternal dialogues, needs to be continued. And again, just to second what Daniel said, even though this seems so obvious to us in 2025, the door was really closed before 1965 in terms of dialogue between Catholics and others. There were some attempts, earlier attempts within the Protestant world to open the door, but opening that door was a huge step. To give you a quote in Nostra Aetate in terms of what Daniel was emphasizing, the charge concerning deicide, though it is never mentioned with that particular name, it says that what happened in his passion cannot be charged against all the Jews without distinction. It's interesting that they had to add the words without distinction. Then alive, nor against the Jews of today. And the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God. Those probably are the most important claims of Nostra Aetate, because they contradicted centuries of church teachings and included, now here I'm going to have to be careful, in either what is explicit or what may be understood from some clear New Testament texts, most clearly the end of the book of Matthew, Matthew 27:25, the very well-known blood cry. Some of you might remember the discussion around this in the Mel Gibson movie, The Passion of Christ, where the New Testament reads, then the people, namely the Jews, at that point, as a whole answered, his blood be upon us and on our children. Thus, the claim of Nostra Aetate that, quote, it decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone may be its most important claim. But Nostra Aetate, as Daniel hinted, has certain claims that are less commendable. Some of you may have worked on committees. No document presented by a committee is ever going to be perfect. And certainly if it goes through 4 rounds, it usually gets worse after each round. So for example, for me, the statement taken from the New Testament epistle of Paul to the Ephesians that, quote, indeed the church believes that by his cross, Christ our peace, reconciled Jews and Gentiles, making both of them one in himself. That seems to make Judaism disappear. Its claim, quote, God holds the Jews most dear for their sake of their fathers, end quote, shows no appreciation for the existence or the importance of Judaism and Jews in 1965. And finally, the statement that, quote, "The church is the new people of God," is supersessionist, reflecting replacement theology, an issue that I'm happy to engage in the questions and answers. Finally, Nostra Aetate should be criticized for what it omits: any reference to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, and it offers no sense of Christian culpability for that or for the persecution of Jews at other times. Thankfully, Vatican's statements on Jewish-Christian relations did not end 60 years ago with Nostra Aetate. My favorite of the more recent documents, for obvious reasons, is the 1993 Pontifical Biblical Commission document called The Interpretation of the Bible in the Church. It's an amazing document. I wish that some Jewish group would be able to put together a document that is so brilliant, comprehensive, and liberal. In two places, that 1993 document deals extensively with the Jews. The first is in a section about biblical interpretation, which includes a subsection on Jewish biblical interpretation. Not obvious at all that it should. It notes, Jewish biblical scholarship in all its richness, from its origins in antiquity down to the present day, is an asset of the highest value for the exegesis of both testaments, provided that it is used with discretion. I'm realizing discretion must be a favorite word of the Vatican. This is remarkable, given how difficult medieval, especially biblical interpretation is, and how often it is ignored by non-Christian scholars. The document further notes, this is a long quote, excuse me, but above all, the Church reads the Old Testament in the light of the Paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who brings a radical newness and, with sovereign authority, gives meaning to the scriptures that is decisive and definitive. This new determination of meaning has become an integral part of Christian faith. I'm taking a breath. It could have stopped there. It continues. It ought not, however, mean doing away with all attempts to be consistent with that earlier canonical interpretation which preceded the Christian Passover. One must respect each stage of the history of salvation. To empty out of the Old Testament its own proper meaning would be to deprive the new of its roots in history. In other words, the Jewish interpretive tradition, which looks at the Tanakh without recourse to the New Testament, is legitimate. The document notes very honestly concerning the fundamental differences between Jewish and Christian beliefs. I quote, "These two diverse starting points create, as regards the interpretation of the scriptures, two different contexts, which for all their points of contact and similarity are in fact radically diverse." Go talk to your Christian friends about what an Old Testament text means, and you will realize this in real life. In this document, I do not hear a kumbaya moment where we all agree, but more importantly, an honest recognition of differences that must be taken into account with respect. I also very much appreciate that it states, finally, it is worth adding that within the New Testament, as already within the Old, one can see the juxtaposing of different perspectives that sit sometime in tension with one another. And then it gives various examples from the New Testament. One of the characteristics of the Bible is precisely the absence of a sense of systematization and the presence, on the contrary, of things held in dynamic tension. Nice way of saying there's no consistency in the Bible and everything disagrees with everything else. The Bible is a repository of many ways of interpreting the same events and reflecting upon the same problems. In itself, it urges us to avoid excessive simplification and narrowness of spirit. End of quote. This point also stands at the basis of my relationship as a practicing Jew to the Jewish Bible, as described in the final chapter of my How to Read the Jewish Bible. The Tanakh is an anthology with many different opinions on almost every issue, and we must always ask, how do we decide as individuals or a community which texts to accentuate and which to minimize? But for Christians who take the New Testament seriously, this point may be even more important. It suggests that the New Testament has many different attitudes, from very positive to very negative, about Jews and Judaism, and Christians should not automatically give authority to the texts that depict or may depict Jews and Judaism negatively. A better known work on Jewish-Christian relations is the Pontifical Biblical Commission's document, The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the Hebrew Bible, and it was published in 2001. It corrects many of the deficiencies of Nostra Aetate. For example, speaking explicitly of the abominable crimes subjected to the Jews, to the terrible ordeal that threatened their very existence throughout most of Europe, and the extermination of the Jews, the Shoah, during the Second World War. And it quotes from the 1993 document, quote, "The Jewish reading of the Bible is a possible one." Most significantly, it acknowledges the problematic nature of the depiction of Jews in the New Testament, claiming that they do not make truth claims about Jews for all times. It illustrates how the Bible as an anthology may be used constructively within the church when it states, quote, "To the question of whether the election of Israel remains valid, Paul gives two different answers." Again, Bible as an anthology, and follows up by claiming the New Testament never says that Israel has been rejected, and Israel continues to be in a covenant relationship with God, because the covenant promise is definitive and cannot be abolished. A final Catholic document that I'd like to mention was written a decade ago for the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. It is again from the Commission of the Holy See for Religious Relations with the Jews, and has one of the longest titles that I've ever seen of any document. Here's the title: "The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Revocable," Romans 11:29, a reflection on theological questions pertaining to Catholic-Jewish relations on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Okay, that's all the title. It tweaks the position of Nostra Aetate concerning replacement theology. It says, the church is called the new people of God, but not in the sense that the people of God of Israel has ceased to exist. The church does not replace the people of the God of Israel, since as the community founded on Christ, it represents in him the fulfillment of the promises made to Israel. This does not mean that Israel, not having achieved such a fulfillment, can no longer be considered to be the people of God. I hope you caught the triple negative there. Although the church is the new people of God, the Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this follows from the Holy Scripture. A radical claim compared to the 1960s. Finally, in places where it sees some inevitable conflict between Judaism and Christianity, it evokes the image of, quote, divine mystery. For example, it claims that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable. So therefore, you don't need to convert the Jews. But how that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains an unfathomable divine mystery. I don't know if that's an I or a good. I keep going back and forth on that one. All of these clarifications of Nostra Aetate are very welcome from a Jewish perspective. And this brings me to Jewish perspectives and responses. I do not have much time to discuss the Jewish side of this dialogue, an area that Daniel is much more expert in. I would just like to make several quick observations. The first directly relates to what Daniel was saying earlier about the discussion even before Nostra Aetate was published, and deals with a contrast between Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. In 1964, Soloveitchik wrote an article, Confrontation, published in the Orthodox journal Tradition. There he eschews, and some would say prohibits, in the wake of the Shoah, Jewish-Christian dialogue on any theological matter. He concludes that article by saying, I quote, "I hope and pray that our friends in the community of the many," in other words, non-Jews, "will sustain their liberal convictions and humanitarian ideals by articulating their position on the right of the community of the few to live, create, and worship God in its own way, in freedom and with dignity," end quote. In other words, he's saying, and please realize how close this is to the Shoah, please leave us, a beleaguered, recently decimated religious minority, alone. In contrast, Heschel in 1966 published an essay, No Religion is an Island. The title itself suggests his differences with Soloveitchik. Heschel argues, quote, "We must choose between interfaith or internihilism," and says, "Parochialism has become untenable. And most remarkably, in this eon, diversity of religions is the will of God." Okay, I find it so interesting when people know what the will of God is. This is the first of the second time this is about to happen. I will close in this section by mentioning two more recent Jewish documents. The first deserves its own anniversary celebration. This is the 25th anniversary of Dabru Emet, Hebrew for speak truth, a Jewish statement on Christians and Christianity, published on September 10th, 2000. It was written by 4 professors and signed later by over 200 rabbis and Jewish academics. It opens by speaking of a dramatic and unprecedented shift in Jewish and Christian relations. It, in many places, is the mirror image of Catholic and other Christian statements, and from the Jewish side, opened the way to significant dialogue, noting, for example, the claim that the difference about who the true Redeemer, quote, who is the true Redeemer, will, quote, not be settled by one community insisting that it has interpreted Scripture more accurately than the other, nor by exercising political power over the other. I find this especially remarkable, given that many Jews over the ages have claimed that Christian Christological interpretations of the Tanakh are simply wrong. This is a rejection of that notion. 15 years later, in December 2015, a group of 25 Orthodox rabbis promulgated a document called To Do the Will of Our Father in Heaven, toward a partnership between Jews and Christians. Subsequently, other Orthodox rabbis signed this text. It's not as far-reaching as Dabru Emet, but is noteworthy, especially given Soloveitchik's confrontation essay. Its title comes from its remarkable claim. We seek to do the will of our Father in heaven by accepting the hand offered to us by our Christian brothers and sisters. Jews and Christians must work together as partners to address the moral challenges of our era. But I'll point out that's a much narrower notion of working together than in many of the other documents that we have seen. I was also asked to talk a little bit about my personal journey, how I, as a Jewish boy who grew up in Borough Park in Brooklyn, became interested in the New Testament and ultimately had an opportunity to present the Jewish annotated New Testament along with my co-editor, Amy Jill Levine, a distinguished New Testament scholar, to Pope Francis in March 2019. Here's my very brief version, and I'm happy to fill this in later in the questions and answers. Some of you may know the phrase from Pirkei Avot, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, avera goreret avera. A good deed causes another good deed, a sin causes another sin. I would like to revise it for my case. Editing one Bible causes editing another Bible, and so forth. So about 30 years ago, I got an email, or it might have even been a letter or a call, from Donald Krauss, the executive editor of Bibles from Oxford University Press, who says we're about to come out, I think then it was with the 4th edition of the Oxford Annotated Bible, and he's not Jewish, he's Episcopalian, said, we've never had a Jew who's been involved in this project. And he said that he reviewed the previous edition, and he was very upset when he looked at the sections concerning the Old Testament, and he saw that some of them contained this distinction, this type of following of Marcion, of law versus love. And he felt that this has no place in an academic Bible edition. This is the edition that is used most in college courses, for example. So he said, it's about time that we had a Jewish sub-editor. Your job is to do Torah and some other stuff, but your main job is to make sure that there is no anti-Judaism in the entire Old Testament section. So that's how I got involved in the world of editing. A few years later, he calls me back and says, all right, Mark, we have a Catholic study Bible. I know that Jews, he didn't quite say this, I know that Jews buy books even though they don't necessarily read them. It would be a good idea for us to publish a Jewish study Bible as well. Would you like to edit it with Professor Adele Berlin from University of Maryland? I'll say half seriously, it really is good to get royalties off of the Bible. So I indeed did say yes to this particular request, which I also felt was an important thing to do. And then a few years after doing that, Don and I were talking, and I said, I actually enjoy this editing more than I thought I would. Maybe we should do a sequel. 2 years later, he comes back to me and says, he said that he was in Oxford. He had spoken to the synods, the big shots who run Oxford University Press, and they just approved a Jewish annotated New Testament. How would you like to edit it with New Testament scholar Amy Jill Levine? And that is how editing one Bible caused editing another Bible, caused more and more interest for me in the New Testament, and my collaboration and friendship with AJ, with Amy Jill Levine. Then in 2019, AJ was the first Jewish professor teaching New Testament at one of the Vatican universities. I was spending a semester then in Israel. I happened to jump from there, and I said, maybe I'll come visit, arrange some lectures. I arranged some lectures, spoke to some of my friends, and I said to one of them, by the way, when I'm in Rome, do you think I can meet the Pope? That is how this meeting started. Okay, this friend took this idea seriously, arranged for a presentation of the Jewish annotated New Testament. I have some pictures here if you want to see them, to the Pope in St. Peter's Square. We were sitting in the first row, and it's a really fun sort of thing. So Pope Francis running around in his Pope mobile, saying hello to everybody who has front row tickets, which are usually people who have paid enough money or have some very important gift that they want to give to the Vatican. So if you've ever been to the Vatican Museum, most of what's there are tchotchkes that were given to the Pope or another over the last 1,000 years plus. So when I say tchotchkes, the person in front of me had a giant 4-foot-long depiction of the crucifixion made out of petrified wood. Okay, So the Pope is walking around with his assistant. Later. Okay, but the person is walking around with his assistant who takes this petrified wood. And then the Pope starts to talk to us. And he had been briefed about the volume. And then this is incredibly gratifying. He goes to his assistant. This is an important book. Please put it where I can find it. Okay, so it did not end up in the same corner as the petrified wood crucifix. There was some newspaper coverage of this as well. So there was a nice article in the official Vatican newspaper. A bridge between Jews, Judaism, and Christianity. So it got some coverage as well, and thus that is the main story of that. And this whole experience has encouraged me to work more in this issue, speaking and writing in this area, and it's been very gratifying. It's not something that I ever anticipated doing 40 years ago, but I'm happy that I've done it. And within the next half year or so, the publication of the 3rd edition of the Jewish Annotated, the New Testament, that should be out with still more essays and significant revisions. And we're already working on a presentation to Pope Leo. So thank you for your attention. And I think we say both of our names. We're happy for questions. And
Amazing. Thank you so much. Incredible. We're going to take some questions now. I would ask you to please, and we're going to pass around some pictures, and I'll ask you to please make sure you're asking questions and not statements. Thank you.
Do either of you have the sense that recent official Catholic pronouncements against the Gaza war have undermined Catholic moves towards reconciliation?
So we specialize in light questions here.
You could answer this question either with a very long answer or a very short answer. My short answer would be, I don't think so. I think that with regard to the general statement, Vatican approaches towards Judaism, precisely because of the complicated nature of Judaism, which also has a political layer to it, the Catholic attitude really tries to draw a line between the religious and the political. And they're aware that it is a tricky attempt, but that is their attempt. And therefore, reconciliation with the Jews and Judaism is one certain kind of pursuit, and general statements about political affairs is another pursuit.
yeah, I have very much the same sense. And when I speak to my friends who are affiliated with the university there, that's very much the sense that I get. And that's one advantage of compartmentalization. There is a division in the Vatican that deals with the Jews, and it predominantly deals with the Jews separately than dealing with the Jews of the state of Israel.
Thank you, and thank you for the terrific presentations. A theological question. In the 4 meetings that preceded the publication of Nostra Aetate, it seems to me that one possibility was to exonerate the Jews for the deicide charge, but the other possibility was to congratulate them, to take away the culpability, but assign responsibility as God's plan, because without the deicide, there's no vicarious atonement, which is the fundamental principle of Christianity. Did that ever come up, this notion that the Jews were actually serving God's purpose?
Excellent question. This is part of the complicated nature of the question was, I'll paraphrase. According to Christian doctrine, the fact that Jesus died on the cross basically brought redemption to the world. Therefore, something about the death of Christ is very, very positive. And in the same breath, there's blaming Jews for killing Christ, which is a negative, right? So something like, did this dialectic with the fact that if you blame the Jews, if you hold the Jews responsible for killing Jesus, is that not actually congratulating them for playing a very active part in bringing redemption? It's an excellent question. It also really reflects the complicated relationship that Christianity has towards Judaism, which is also at once, there's a foundational relationship there, very positive and also very negative. To answer specifically your question, yes, this was constantly discussed. It's also why the deicide accusation never became official dogma. More than that, in the Council of Trent, 16th century, the Catholic Church declared all humanity is responsible for the death of Christ, and all humanity benefits from its fruits, which is the possibility of salvation. But again, there's a difference between official elite documents that are stated by intellectuals and how things are on the ground. So to your question, yes, this was very much part of the discussion because it was both political and theological. So yes.
Thanks so much for coming. Actually, as an extension of that, as an extension of that question, I wondered during the deliberations among the Jews who were participating in the council deliberations, was there any recognition that, if the story is in any way true, that Jewish rabbis contributed to the prosecution of Jesus initially, and that whether he is God or not, they have contributed. They somehow, there's an acknowledgement that there is a role for the Jews in the death itself. The other question I have is whether, when you said, I thought it was interesting when you said there's no official dogma, or there's never been an official dogma of the Jews committed deicide. Could you expand on that a little bit? Does that mean the Pope has never declared that Jews killed God?
Those are both yours, really. You're the council. You're the council guy.
Okay, I'm going to try to answer both those questions together because they're closely related. On the one hand, the verses that from New Testament that Mark, from Matthew's that Mark quoted, that Jesus' blood is on our hands and our children's hands, that is the verse that is really at the center of this tradition that the Jews are responsible for killing Christ, and also really the source of a centuries-long negative images of Jews in Christianity. Now, as Marc said, also Christianity has different things to say about Judaism. And the deliberations during the council as to how should we interpret the Holy Scripture of the New Testament dealt with these questions of biblical interpretation. And some of the arguments that were made in favor of renouncing the accusation of deicide was, for example, yes, specific Jews were involved in that incident, but if you read the verses closely, they're talking about the leaders, and who these leaders were is questionable. The second thing is, okay, so say 72 or 49, or how many Jews were involved in this event, said the responsibility is on us and our children forever. That doesn't say anything about the responsibility of other people, other Jews who lived during the time of Christ, right? There were other people in Jerusalem at the time who had no idea this was going on. People were in the Galilee. completely oblivious to it, right? People lived in Egypt or elsewhere. So there's, even if these specific Jews say we are responsible, this says nothing about the collective of Jews. And of course, it would say nothing about Jews who were born after this event entirely, right? In addition, there's also theological arguments saying, well, okay, so some of the Jews are responsible, but Jesus himself said, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing." So even those who are guilty were already forgiven right at that very same event. So these were some of the arguments that were saying, yes, whatever happened with regards to the Jews, it is irrelevant to the accusation of collective guilt of all Jews. Now, I will add that after the Holocaust in the 60s, the claim that a collective is guilty for the actions of a subsection of the collective had different resonances. And you had a lot of German cardinals in the Vatican who said, well, just in the same way that I should not be blamed for what other Germans did in the Holocaust, this notion of collective guilt, well, Jews who lived 2,000 years ago don't continue the guilt, the collective guilt for others. So that was also a consideration.
Okay, just one second.
It was never certified in the way that the church certifies things. It was preached and known and written in textbooks, etc. It was never certified as this is the official.
Let me just add one quick thing. Daniel said something quickly that was subtle, important, and true, and I'm afraid it may get lost. As an anthology, the New Testament has different claims about Jewish responsibility. And it is important, very important, which particular gospel you are looking at with regard to that. And I'll just call two resources to your extent, both of them out within the last year. One of them is a book called The Documentary History of Jewish-Christian Relations, which has as its first chapter New Testament texts which deal with Jews. It doesn't deal with Jews and Christians. There were no Christians yet. Jews who did not believe in Christ versus Jews who did believe in Christ, and the differences as they are reflected in the New Testament. And secondly, aside from the fact that there's a diversity of the texts, I mean, all texts are open to interpretation. So to give you a very simple example, that the blood cry from Matthew chapter 27, even in its original context, which is probably immediately following the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, how much can we remove that from that particular historical context? Was that really meant as a declaration of a condemnation of Jews for all times? And secondly, I didn't bring it today, but there's another new book with the title Judeophobia, which goes through the New Testament. It's largely written for college students and college professors and intelligent lay people, which goes through all of the New Testament texts plus some non-canonical early Christian texts, looks at its potentially Judeo-phobic claims, and asks about each of them, is this really Judeo-phobic, or has this become Judeo-phobic as a result of centuries of interpretation? It's a quite good and very readable book, and I would highly commend it.
Okay, we're going to take a few more
And then
questions.
there's been a question up here from the very beginning.
Yes, okay.
Another question from that is that the King James translation, or is that
Is what?
the Judeo-phobic?
No, it's all translations. Look, part of the problem is in translation. I mean, I'll just say the biggest issue concerning translation really relates in some ways to your question. And this is a huge debate that is happening both within Christianity and within Jewish circles. The Greek term Judaios, which can be translated as either Jews or Judeans. How do we translate that in different contexts? And it has lots of important relevance. Yes,
Oh,
please.
sorry. So my original question was about how this Catholic document if it was ever presented to the Protestant world, because growing up in East Tennessee in the 70s with John 3:16 spray painted everywhere and being called a Christ killer, and 30 years later, 40 years later, it's still happening.
And can I build on that? You Mark had said that you would speak a bit about supersessionism, and maybe Krisha's question, part of Krisha's question is, how might we, as Jews today, enter into discussions, if they are in fact good faith discussions with people who have such beliefs?
So in this volume concludes with a collection of documents. And the first document, I mean, first of all, it is noteworthy that Nostra Aetate is from 1965, right? Which is, could decide 20 years after the end of World War II. Is that a little time or a long time? That depends on your sense of time and I guess how old you are. But the first document that you have here is what is called the 10 Points of Seligsburg, which is a German document from 1947. Okay, so it is important to remember, we all talk about Nostra Aetate because of the importance of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church can speak for all world Catholics. That is not the case of this particular 1947 document. And so a few issues. There were further documents, and again, you could see them all in here. Some of them are from the United States, many of them are not from the United States. But the major problem with all of these documents is the distance between the official documents as they become proclaimed and what the preachers in the different congregations do and whether or not it reaches those particular preachers. And there I take my hat off, my kippah off to my coworker, AJ Levine, who every Sunday is in one or two different churches, speaking to people, trying to change those attitudes. And it takes a very, very long time for those attitudes to change. And we can help in terms of what we say. I don't think there's anything wrong. If a non-Jew calls to my attention a Jewish source I don't know about, which happens in the scholarly world all the time, that's great. Similarly, we can call attention to these documents to various people. Okay, you asked me supersessionism on 1 foot in 2 minutes, because this is a more than a 2-minute discussion. There's been so I'll offer you what I call my basic principle for interreligious dialogue, which is you should not criticize another person's religious tradition unless you're willing to criticize parts of your own religious tradition and to hear criticism of your own religious tradition. So I think, and this could be a full 45-minute talk, in Jewish-Christian relations, there are 2 different elephants in the room. There's the elephant of supersessionism, which is to what extent has the church superseded Judaism or not? And there's heavy supersessionism, there's economic supersessionism. Michael Novak has a term called soft supersessionism, which is certainly better than hard supersessionism. But I think that there has to be at least an admission that historically, supersessionism has been part of the Christian tradition, not only the Catholic tradition. But what's the other elephant in the room from the Jewish side? And I'm well aware of the fact that I'm sitting where 2 hours ago the Bima was, where people were reciting before the Torah reading, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim. There is an issue of chosenness. And does chosenness mean betterness? Is there more than one blessing and so forth? So I think we have to be honest about our tradition, its complications, and the extent to which it's a very serious question. And this, I've had disagreements. I know that there's some modern scholars, for example, John Levinson, who teaches at Harvard, whom I respect tremendously, but who tries to downplay the chosenness of chosenness, I would say. It's a very significant Jewish tradition. And I think, let the two elephants fight it out in the room together. I don't quite know what to say.
Thank you. That's really helpful. All right, we're going to take 2 more questions.
Hi, this is partially adding on to Krisha's question. But did I not get the memo? I was taught that the Romans killed Christ, and you guys didn't mention that at all. And so I would like you to address that. And also, to Krisha's point, I have a friend who went all through Catholic school in the 60s and 70s in New Jersey. And she was shocked when I told her that there was this document that absolved Jews. So I didn't get the memo, about the something where it's now back to being the Jews and not the Romans. And why aren't Catholics who go to Catholic school not getting the memo about this?
Yes, excellent question. I've been doing a lot of archival material, a lot of archival research to uncover a lot of what Jews were doing during the time of the council. And I found this really beautiful correspondence, interesting correspondence between a Jewish leader and a Catholic leader, where the Catholic writes him, he says, "Us Jews and Catholics, when our clock ticks, it ticks in centuries." And the Jewish leader responded, "We've waited enough centuries. We don't want to wait for any more ticks." And really, the immediate response in the Jewish world to those who were involved with the council, when they saw the Nostra Aetate was promulgated, and they saw that it was an imperfect text, a compromise, and almost all of the official statements from Jewish bodies were, this document will be judged according to its implementation. So leading cardinals and bishops can convene for 4 years in the beautiful halls of the Vatican and discuss and say whatever they want to say. But reality is the test. And if now in a congregation in Brazil is still being taught the accusation of deicide, or missionaries in China are teaching their flock about so Nostra Aetate doesn't have the importance, or will not have the importance that people hope it will. Whether that really is the question of implementation. There's always a gap between official teachings and what is taught. Things are dramatically better than they were previously, and there's still a long, long way to go. With regarding to the memo, I think that what's difficult is that there are a lot of memos going around, and you may have not received one, or your friend has not received another, but this is part of the complication. Who is guilty? Who is responsible for killing Jesus? Well, it depends on what verses you emphasize, in light of what traditions you read them, how you read them, who your teacher was, what you want to believe.
I mean, that's what Daniel was saying, that what I was saying earlier, there are different Judaios are culpable to different degrees in different books in the New Testament. So in some cases, it really all falls on the Romans. In some cases, the Jewish complicity is more significant. Jews did not have the rights themselves to do the capital punishment, but the question really concerns the extent of Jewish complicity. But let me just emphasize, I'm going to pick up on something that Daniel said. And really, maybe I'm better off returning to my colleague, Amy Jill Levine. We wrote together a recent article in a journal called Interpretation, which again, you want to talk about differences. So this is a journal largely read by pastors and biblical scholars, largely written by biblical scholars. First of all, they just decided to have an issue on anti-Semitism. Okay, that in and of itself is significant. And one of the points that AJ and I make in the article, and this is really her point, this is, excuse me for using the term crusade, a crusade she has been on for several decades, is changing theological education, right? That in most theology schools, there is no requirement to study, Protestant theology schools, no requirement to take a course in Jewish studies, okay? No requirement to understand anything about the Jewishness of Jesus or the Jewish background of the New Testament. And she has tried to work. There are like American theological organizations that deal with divinity school education, and has tried to work with them to create such requirements for a very long time, but with no success. And until there is success in those areas, these kinds of comments will continue. Though I agree with Daniel, we are in a better situation than we were decades ago. We're still not in the best situation in which we can be. There's work to do.
Okay, last question.
Thank you so much for your comments. Being a Catholic myself, I'm from Immaculate Conception here, and I've taught courses on this issue. I was curious, the topic being in our time, precisely being in my 40s and a product of Vatican II, and being a Vatican II baby, my experience, and I think many of growing up as Vatican II, we were taught you can't be a Christian unless you're a Jew at heart. The foundation of the faith is Judaism, and we had this sense very much that God's covenants endure forever. We were told that at very early ages in our Catholic schools, and so the covenants endure. And so it's a very different narrative than maybe what was going on in 1965, which made this such a revolutionary document. And so does that affect the kind of teaching and instruction that maybe the research and work that you're doing now is? Because even working over at Immaculate Conception, the young people that I work with, so many are sort of taught quite differently about our relationship to Judaism. There's not that supersession, trust me, anti-Semitism absolutely exists. It's up 800% in some studies, but it's a more of anti-Semitism as opposed to anti-Judaism. And that distinction is very important because of the way the narrative is done. They're being taught a lot of sort of source redaction, form criticism, and stuff like that within the theological language, but the narrative has shifted of how the manifestation of the prejudice is being manifested. And I was curious if you had comments on that.
Catholic education, I'm thrilled. I was thrilled to hear the beginning of your comments, and welcome to the synagogue. It's good. There's some wonderful Catholic education in places and some wonderful Protestant education in places. But going back to the earlier question, this wonderful education is not widespread enough. And I think that is really my concern. And one place where I felt this very significantly is several years ago, I co-taught a course on scripture with a New Testament colleague and a Quran colleague. You know, it sounds like a bad joke, like a Jew, a Christian, whatever, walk into a bar. Anyway, we got very, very significant Islamophobic and anti-Semitic comments from our students in the weekly assignments. So much so that I wrote about this for one of Bart Ehrman's blogs and had discussions about this, and other colleagues told me that this is still the case. And this happened, and it is very hard to unlearn things. I mean, these are bright Duke students. And maybe they weren't listening to what we were saying, but there were several times where we made it very clear, certain things are simply not acceptable to write on scholarly grounds. but these habits are very, very difficult to unlearn. But I think are slowly being unlearned in some places. And it sounds like you are part of that unlearning. And I thank you very much for that.
I just want to quickly add that anyone who spends time studying religious traditions quickly learns that traditions don't go away. Nothing ever disappears. What you can have is certain traditions become lower, the voices become more whispered, and alternative traditions become more salient. In 1958, when Pope John decided to start this council, the most popular religious figure in Italy at the time was a guy named Lombardi, and he was this charismatic preacher. They called him the voice of God because he had this very popular radio sermon every year. And in 1958, he drew a connection between the Holocaust and the accusation of deicide. And he said, basically, of course, the genocide against the Jews and the Holocaust was horrible, but it's nothing in comparison to the sin of deicide, right? So the Holocaust happened as a punishment for that. And at this very same time, in Italy, you have Pope John, who says we need to rethink our attitude toward Jews and Judaism completely. So at the same time, in the same area, you have two opposite views about the very same tradition, the very same question. And the question is, those two views are not going to disappear. The question is, which one wins the day? And that is where education, textbooks, encounter, that's where that comes in.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Daniel Herskowitz, Professor Marc Brettler, for this really important history and for contextualizing it so beautifully and meaningfully for us today. Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.